Next, please welcome to the stage J.P. Morgan Chair of Global Research Joyce Chang and Commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission Kimberly Glass for a conversation with journalist Bob Davis on the economic consequences of a deteriorating relationship.
Are we ready? Oops, I guess we are ready. All right, so this is the economic portion of the event. And I thought the way to kind of think about that is, just for years and years and years, we've been thinking about a China that grows at historic rates. How to deal with a growing China, how to deal with a more prosperous China. I looked at the national security strategies of the United States since Reagan, and each one of them, aside from the Trump administration, said a prosperous China is in America's interest. Now, you can debate whether that's true or not, but the question now is, what about a stagnating China? So is a stagnating China in America's interest? And if it is, should the U.S. be trying to push that stagnation, trying to hobble it in some fashion or other? So I thought we'd start. Joyce, you've been studying the economy there for quite some time. Maybe you can give a roundup of where you think we're at.
Well, China has announced stimulus in August quite recently, and we actually think that China will grow at 5.2% this year. So we think they will meet the 5% growth target. But all of that said, China's growth will slow down. Part of that is demographics, part of it is the debt burden. But we do think that by the 2030s, you will be looking at more like a 3% growth rate in China. But even at a 3% growth rate, even with China slowing down, I think there is a reality for the U.S. that that is still the largest middle class. It is still the largest #1 trading partner for 120 countries in the world. And we're looking at a period, generally speaking, where global growth is slowing down. We're not going to see the kinds of growth numbers that we saw back in the early 2000s again. So I think that though China does face a lot of domestic challenges in addition to the foreign policy considerations that we're talking about, and much of that is really the question on whether they are going to be able to rebalance their economy towards domestic consumption, which has been the goal of the common prosperity. So even the stimulus that has been put into place, it's really not hitting the household level. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of where confidence starts, at the household level in China, in the private sector, as well as in the foreign policy arena. So I think that there is a determination to hit the growth target this year, that China has the policy tools to be able to do that. But there's much less conviction about the medium-term outlook and whether this rebalancing and reorientation of the economy away from this investment-led model more towards domestic consumption will work.
But I mean, the U.S., the World Bank, the IMF have been pounding on China for decades to shift more to a consumption-based growth, right? I mean, it's been the mantra, at least since the Clinton years. Why do you think, and I think if you talk to China's economists, they would agree with that, right? I mean, the Chinese economists that deal with the West anyway. So why do you think it hasn't happened?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, but over the last few years, the regulatory environment had a lot to do with that. You've seen that private sector investment, including the domestic private sector investment, has come down. It's been led by state-owned companies. But you also have precautionary savings in China, in part because there's uncertainty on the employment outlook. The youth unemployment rate is over 20% in China right now, and you don't have a strong social safety net, on the healthcare system. And in addition to that, you also have the property sector as well, going through a real period of restructuring that's going to take a very long time. So this is not inspiring confidence for households to let go of their savings.
Mm-hmm. And one last one on the economy. You've talked in some of your reports, and there's been a note generally about huge outflows of money going out of China. Can you explain what's going on?
Well, I would say that there's two ways to look at China. There's doing business in China, the foreign direct investment flows, and then there's the portfolio flows, buying the debt and equities of China. And on the portfolio flows, we have seen really large outflows. Part of this is due to the rise in U.S. Treasury yields, that there are other alternatives that are giving yields. But I would say in the fixed income market, for example, you've seen probably about half of the inflows that went in from 2019 come out since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then you have the China property sector, where about 60% of the China high-yield property market has defaulted. So that is, kind of an unheard of statistic when you look at just sectors of the economy. That's gone into default. So there's been a lot of outflows. Now, what we're beginning to see is this year, that's actually hitting some of the foreign direct investment inflows. The portfolio outflows happen more quickly. You would expect some of that, but this year we're also seeing that, looking at the balance of payments, you've come to like a 26-year low on foreign direct investment. That still doesn't change the fact, though, that's not deglobalization, in my opinion, because the trade that China is doing has remained very consistent. It's just the trading partners have shifted. But we are beginning to see, even in the FDI flows, some real effects right now in addition to portfolio outflows, which started really in early 2022.
And Kim, let's shift to sort of economic policy. Do you think the goal of the United States ought to be to decouple or to de-risk, if there's any difference whatsoever in those two terms? How do you look at it from a policy point of view?
Well, I agree with much of what Joyce said around the current state of the economy. I think it's no state secret that we are de-risking. I think American companies who've had investments in China are looking at other markets. I think they're looking at de-risking their risk assessment in that particular country. And so decoupling, I think, connotates we're overall divorcing. It's a much more complicated relationship because of our trade status, but I think a lot of people are positioned to de-risk, and the U.S.-China Commission was created by Congress to look at these issues in a bipartisan way, and our commission report is coming out next week, and we're going to be talking about what are the elements that we're seeing in the economic trends, as well as some of the de-risking strategies that companies are now deploying.
And is there a recommendation for how to de-risk? How would you approach that? A company came to you and said, listen, we're worried about China. There's 100 different reasons to worry. What should we do?
I think both from a public policy perspective of what the administration's putting forward with what Capitol Hill stakeholders are putting forward in legislation, as well as at the company level, there's already a de-risking strategy. So we have the outbound investment rulemaking process. We have export controls on semiconductors. We are seeing less foreign direct investment in U.S. companies at an all-time low over the last, 26 years in China. We're also seeing Chinese companies de-risking out of China. They are moving into other market economies like Mexico and other areas of the world to either avoid paying tariffs. And I think the larger question, Bob, is what are the implications of the current economic state in China to the U.S. economy, right? Because it's not a transparent system. We have rampant unemployment. They have a housing bubble. They have a real estate crisis. They have an infrastructure crisis. These are things that are not often reported by the Chinese government. And I think companies are understanding the opaqueness of that structure actually puts some of their assets at risk. and are taking strategic, we've talked to many American companies who've invested in China, who are looking at, my investment in China is to service the Chinese market, but for all the other markets, we're investing elsewhere to service those markets. So I think part of almost every strategic plan these days is to look at that assessment.
So let's talk about that. I mean, as you're saying, the impact on the United States. So when you think about it, is it a positive? So China's slowing. Everyone agrees China's slowing. I mean, I think an open question is, as you say, if it goes from 5% to 3%, does it go to 5% and then 3% the next year, and that's a problem, or is it kind of a slow glide path, a soft landing, as the Fed would call it? So what do you think? Is it a positive thing or a negative thing that China's slowing and has all these problems for the U.S.?
I would be concerned. So if you have such rampant unemployment amongst your youth, and high employment industries like infrastructure and whatnot are pulling back spending, and you have a debt problem in China, in order to help maintain social stability, which is what the party is there designed to do, it's a very different system than the system that we have here, and to strengthen their positioning within the Chinese infrastructure, you're going to see continued rampant subsidies for industries that will impact our manufacturing sector and others globally, because they're not consuming the products that they want. Their consumption model has slowed down. And I think that's going to have real implications to the global economy on what we're going to be seeing in the marketplace and the flood of subsidized imports, whether it's to the United States market or other market economies.
So Joyce, let me try the flip side of that. Let's say that's the case. Cheap imports to the United States. China's maybe at least flirting with deflation. Why wouldn't that be a good thing for the United States? Cheap imports, reduce inflation, the kind of issue that we had pretty much until COVID, I would say. Why isn't that a positive? Or do you think it is a positive?
No, I think that very much to Kim's point, I mean, that U.S. businesses are looking at diversification, whether it is China +1, whether it is some of this nearshoring or this friendshoring. But what they want to really see is, sort of some level of predictability on the policy side. And so there were some regulatory measures that U.S. businesses and domestic businesses also felt were not well explained by the government. And I think that, big picture, if you look at the numbers, the way we look at it is every 1% decline that you see in China's growth takes about 0.2% off of global growth overall. But it's zero for the U.S. because the U.S. is not as dependent on China as some other countries. But if you're in an emerging markets that is exporting commodities like Latin America, it's like 1% down is 0.7% down. So there is a global impact because China demand, there's very little that replaces China demand. But for the U.S., which is a consumer economy, I mean, the cheap goods, has been very helpful. I think when you look at some of these big picture effects of policy, you do have to ask the question, if you're no longer choosing who you do business with based on the lowest cost of production, are you ultimately going to have somewhat higher inflation, more volatility in the marketplace? And so this rise in more industrial policies is bringing up those questions that we're looking at lower growth overall, including for the U.S. Going forward, not just for China, but for where we are as far as just the cost of this geoeconomic fragmentation.
So Kim, do you agree with that? Do you agree that this move toward de-risking and so on and moving away from China might slow global growth, but might be, I would imagine, maybe your argument might be it's worth it, essentially? Things have a cost, right?
Yeah, things have a cost. First off, just to make a point on what Joyce said, I think that having dumped products into the U.S. marketplace, putting people out of jobs and good wages is not an overall benefit to the U.S. economy and our ability to purchase the kinds of products we need to make. Sadly, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act being strong bipartisan support out of Congress, we're seeing cotton production in places like Xinjiang increase and making its way into our closets and things like that. So there's more enforcement activities that are necessary to stop what is called the illegal trade happening right now. But overall, I think everyone is looking at a de-risking model, whether it's nearshoring to places like Mexico or Central America, or diversifying their portfolio, and that's a good thing. There's something happening in the global economy right now that's a real structural change. It's because China is not progressing in their own structural changes as quickly enough, because people are seeing that there's a risk here, and that the risks have been amplified over the last few years as there's more opaqueness in their structure. So I think COVID was a seminal event in the global economy as supply chains started to break down. And it really illuminated for boards, and illuminated for investors, we can't put everything in the China basket. How do we diversify our portfolio and take into account the geopolitical risks of putting everything over in China/Asia?
No, I think we have here, like, in a nutshell, the sort of paradox or the dilemma of globalization, right? So again, let's assume what folks are saying is true, that there's going to be a flood of subsidies, cheaper goods into the U.S. So on the one hand, yeah, that'll put some people out of business, certainly, and will wind up hurting communities that depend on companies that compete with China. On the other hand, if you have cheaper goods and inflation's a problem, it might help to drive down inflation. So there's your balance, like, pick your poison, basically. I wanted to ask Kim also, I would say the heart of this administration's efforts to keep ahead of China or keep China behind the U.S., however you want to look at it, technologically is this sort of what they call the export controls, the small fence, no, I get it wrong, high fence, small yard.
Yeah.
And it seemed like it was a really, really high fence in the beginning, and an incredible assertion of American power. And they seem to be backing off a little bit from that. I wonder how you look at where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, first up, there's been a lot of debate in Washington about outbound investment rules on the semiconductor export controls. Please note the Chinese are also deploying export controls on things like critical minerals.
True.
In order to help shield their own market share. So there's been a lot of attention about what the United States is doing, but we have to also look at the reverse of what the Chinese are doing that is a real risk to our economy. So we're seeing the Chinese deploying a lot of their resources into EV technologies to actually be, and I think they are right now, a global leader in EV production. They're looking at high value added industries, whether it's artificial intelligence and whatnot. And so how is the United States going to respond? And are we deploying the policy solutions at both an aggressive enough and rapid enough rate in order to help shore up our ability to have access to these technologies? How are we building out our international relationships for critical mineral ability for us to obtain critical minerals to help get to the clean energy future? These are all key questions right now that I think we're grappling with.
I wonder how both of you look at a certain proposition. So let's talk about areas where the U.S. is clearly behind technologically. Electric vehicles, solar energy, wind power. You can name the ones that you like, but where the U.S. is behind, right? Do you think it would be an appropriate policy for the U.S. to encourage foreign investment from China in those areas where the U.S. is behind, and including if there are subsidies available for U.S.-based companies, meaning companies that produce in the U.S., should they be available for Chinese companies too? Kim, what do you think?
There's economic security concerns. I mean, we're talking very much in theory right now around providing Chinese companies with subsidies of American taxpayer dollars in our facilities. My initial gut reaction to that is we should not be doing that. We should be investing in U.S. companies. There have been various joint ventures in the United States between U.S. companies and Chinese companies for the deployment of EVs and things like that. I would have a big cautionary flag with respect to how U.S. taxpayer dollars are utilized. I do think that the U.S. government has started to move forward with key investments for semiconductors, and there's a lot of conversation in Congress about the guardrails associated with those, how those funds should be used. U.S. taxpayers and communities pay their tax rate, so do U.S. companies, and shouldn't we be helping bolster more domestic production? Are there ways that we can be working with the Chinese to help develop potential technologies or understand how we can advance our own sector? Because obviously climate change is a global issue. Yeah, but what does that look like, I think is, needs to be more thoughtfully considered.
And Joyce, what would you think of encouraging Chinese FDI, and even if it meant providing subsidies, if we provide subsidies for other foreign companies that come and produce in the U.S., like a German company that would set up a
Yeah, I don't even think it has to be about necessarily talking about subsidies. I think there's some realities. I mean, China has had a 30-year monopoly on rare earth and critical minerals, and even the way that a lot of the IRA is written, that you will get these tax credits if you do business in a circle of trust with the allies. You can't even really do that now because we don't have the production capacity. So there has to be some realism that comes into this. But rather than even thinking about subsidies, there's some basic things that one can talk about. That that we're not getting as many of the advanced degree students who are really sort of able to lead in innovation in the advanced sciences into the U.S. from China now. Right? And so rather than saying, do we subsidize this, it's that you need to understand we're still in a global economy where there needs to be a way in which we do work with each other. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily say, we're going to subsidize you in the U.S. to do this, because that's a very specific question. But still, that you need to be able to trade certain things. So I think there has been this whole debate. This is why there's been a little bit of backing away from the sanctions as well, because you've seen that other countries are worried about, can your reserves get confiscated? Do we want to do more in non-dollars? So I wouldn't just say subsidizing to do business in the U.S. There are so many other global linkages, whether it is educational, whether it is trade. And there is a big difference. You can say small yard, high fences, but I think the Chinese are right to say, what does that mean exactly? Because if the size of the yard keeps on changing, we're not sure. And what is really about national security, where both sides will have their industrial policy. So I feel like it often gets turned into a discussion where we basically say, is this about keeping China in or out, rather than actually looking at what do you need in a global economy, since you're the first and second largest economies, to just have some rules of the road, but also to make sure that you do have the tenets of free trade still in place.
I think we have some time for a question. I'm not quite sure how the questions work here. There we are.
Thanks. We actually have a question from George in the UK. He would like to know how reliable you think the Chinese government's data actually is.
Joyce, why don't you go first?
Well, I think there's been some numbers that they haven't been releasing, like the youth unemployment numbers. And the years I've looked at China, we have often found that some of the sample surveys actually give you better data. But I would say this, that on the overall macro data, I don't worry so much about that. And 30 years ago, you could have really questioned that, like the GDP, the inflation numbers, some of these macro numbers. But I think at the more micro level, there are a lot of concerns. Or when something has become a more controversial figure, whether they don't necessarily release it. So I do think that remains something that has always been discussed for those who are looking at the Chinese economy.
And Kim, the Commission clearly needs to deal with the data. How do you all look at it?
With a discerning eye towards data and different data sources that we cite in our report. Like Joyce mentioned, some of the data that used to be available in the global is not available anymore.
Right.
And so if I'm a U.S. company trying to get a real sense about what's happening on the ground there, I would have a real cautionary flag. Do I really know what's underlying in the Chinese economy right now? Do I really have a good sense? Should I have confidence in these numbers? And I would proceed with extreme caution.
Another question?
So Chris, just down the road at SAIS, would like to know, considering the extent of other countries' subsidy packages, both in and outside of China, combined with the vast specialized heavy nature of this industry and all of its segments, is it wise for the U.S. to attempt to onshore the entire semiconductor supply chain, or should we be working together with allies?
You have to work together with allies. I mean, this is why a lot of the IRA has written isn't, actually something that you can, put into place. But that also is going to take time. And you also have to remember that with our allies, they don't look at China necessarily the same way that we do, right? So if you look at Europe, even though there are parts of Europe that look at China as a partner, there are some that look at it as a competitor, like I'd say Germany, the Netherlands, and the US looks at it as a rival. So our allies don't have a uniform view on China, and certainly in emerging markets, you have a greater dependency on China commodities, all kinds of other linkages than you do on the United States. You don't want to pick and choose. So I think it is very important that one does have a multilateral dialogue and the capability to keep that dialogue, very much as the Quincy Institute has kind of convened this type of conversation to keep that into place.
Kim, last word. You have 10 seconds.
No, I think, Joyce, you did a great job.
All right, then we're done. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kim. I look forward to continuing the dialogue.